Welcome to Bookfulness. This is episode 1 in our series focusing on evolution.
That's right. We're diving into, well, a real cornerstone text, the fourth edition of Evolution by Futuyma and Mark Kirkpatrick. It's pretty much the standard.
And our mission today is to really lay the groundwork. We want to unpack the history, the core ideas, the definitions, basically why evolution is considered the unifying theory for, well, all of biology.
If you've ever wondered why this one idea carries so much weight across genetics, ecology, medicine, you name it, this is where we start.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The book makes a really bold claim from the get-go about why studying evolution isn't just optional, it's essential. Why is that?
It really boils down to this. Evolution isn't just another topic within biology. It's the framework that makes sense of all the other topics.
Right.
There's a great quote from the geneticist Francois Jacob, Nobel laureate. He put it very simply. Among these biological theories, the theory of evolution is by far the most important.
That's putting it strongly. And he wasn't just talking about it being interesting historically, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
His point, and the book's point, is that it provides the causal explanations. It connects molecular biology, the tiny stuff, DNA, cells, all the way up to ecology, how organisms interact, how ecosystems function, even paleontology, the fossil record. It's the thread that ties it all together.
So it explains the sheer variety, the heterogeneity of life.
Exactly. Why are there so many different kinds of creatures? Why do they have the specific traits they do? Evolution gives us the why. The book emphasizes that for any biological feature, say a bird's wing or the way a cell metabolizes sugar, you need two perspectives.
Okay, what are those?
First is the current mechanism. The book calls this the proximate cause. How does it work right now? What are the physics, the chemistry, the physiology involved?
That sounds like standard biology, physiology class stuff.
It is. But the second perspective is the one that's often missed or wasn't understood before Darwin. That's the history, the ultimate cause.
The evolutionary explanation.
Precisely. How did this trait come to exist in the first place? Why did it evolve? Why did it persist? You can't fully understand the how without understanding the why from a historical evolutionary standpoint.
It's like trying to understand a modern car engine without knowing anything about Henry Ford or the invention of the internal combustion engine.
That's a great analogy. You'd miss the whole context, the reason it's designed the way it is. Hashtag 1.2, evolution in modern crises, the practical science.
Okay, so it's fundamental theoretically. But, this might still sound a bit academic for some listeners. The book argues it's also incredibly practical, right? Especially with modern health crises.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just about fossils. It's about understanding things that affect us right now, like infectious diseases. Take HIV, for example.
Right. The book uses HIV as a key case study.
Yes, and if you look at figures 1.1 and 1.2, which, just a reminder for listeners, are available in the description out, they show how evolutionary analysis was crucial. We know there are two main types, HIV-1, the pandemic strain, and HIV-2.
And evolution helped trace their origins.
Exactly. Using phylogenetic methods, basically building family trees for viruses based on their genetic sequences, scientists figured out that HIV-1 jumped to humans from chimpanzees, specifically from a virus called SIV-CPD.
SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus.
Right. And HIV-2 came from a different primate, the sooty mangabe, from its version, SIV-OCD. This wasn't just, an academic exercise. Knowing the origins helps understand how these viruses work and how they might emerge in the future.
And didn't this analysis also show something surprising about the timing?
It did. Using what's called a molecular clock, estimating divergence times based on mutation rates, the analysis suggested HIV-1 actually entered the human population way back near the start of the 20th century.
Wow, so decades before the AIDS epidemic really exploded in the 80s.
Decades. Think about that. For fast mutating viruses like HIV, there's no fossil record in the traditional sense. But we can reconstruct their history, their spread, their timing, purely by comparing their genetic sequences and applying evolutionary principles. It's like genetic archaeology.
And this evolutionary thinking is directly applicable to another huge crisis, drug resistance.
Probably the biggest public health threat we face globally right now, yeah. Antibiotic resistance, antiviral resistance.
Yeah.
It's evolution happening on a timescale we can directly observe, often tragically.
The book mentions AZT, the first HIV drug.
A classic, sad example. AZT came out in 1987. It worked, initially. But within just a few years, HIV populations within patients evolved resistance. The drug exerted strong selective pressure, and any viruses with random mutations that conferred even slight resistance survived and multiplied
So the virus population changed.
rapidly. And we see the exact same thing with bacteria. Think Staphylococcus aureus causing hospital infections, or Neisseria gonorrhea. We're running out of effective antibiotics for some strains.
The numbers are frightening. The book cites over 500,000 deaths yearly worldwide just from drug-resistant infections.
And if you look at figure 1.3 in the source material, the link is stark. More antibiotic use correlates directly with higher rates of resistance. It's a perfect, if terrifying, demonstration of natural selection.
Because the antibiotic is the environment, essentially. It selects for resistant variants.
Precisely. Any pre-existing variation that helps a bacterium survive the drug gets favored. Those bacteria reproduce, pass on the resistance genes, and boom, the whole population shifts. Understanding that evolutionary dynamic is step one if we want to manage this crisis. Hashtag 1.3, the unifying mantra of biology.
So this practical application, this fundamental nature, it all comes back to that famous quote by Theodosius Dobzhansky.
Yes, the mantra. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution.
It's probably the most quoted line in biology, right? What does it really capture?
It captures the idea that without the historical evolutionary context, the ultimate cause, we talked about biological facts, often seem arbitrary or just disconnected observations. Evolution provides the unifying narrative, the explanation.
Can you give an example? The book mentions nudibranch.
Right, the sea slugs. Okay, so you observe these creatures, and many of them are incredibly colorful. Just stunningly vibrant patterns. That's the proximate observation. They are colorful. But then you also find out that many of these brightly colored ones are toxic. They often get toxins from the things they eat, like sponges. So why be both toxic and flashy?
Seems counterintuitive, maybe. Like advertising you're dangerous.
Exactly. Without evolution, it doesn't make much sense. But in the light of evolution, specifically natural selection, the explanation becomes clear. The bright colors likely evolved as a warning signal to predators. It's called aposematism.
Like poison dart frogs or monarch butterflies?
Precisely. The color says, don't eat me, I'm nasty. A predator learns to associate the bright color with a bad experience, the toxin,
Right.
and avoids that pattern in the future. So the coloration enhances the survival value of the toxicity.
So the proximate mechanism is the toxin, how it works chemically, but the ultimate reason for the color is its evolved function as a warning, shaped by interactions with predators over generations.
You got it. The evolutionary history gives the color its biological meaning.
This seems like a good point to pause and make sure we're all on the same page with terminology. Words like theory and fact get thrown around a lot, often incorrectly, especially when people discuss evolution.
Absolutely critical. Misunderstanding these terms is the source of so much confusion. Let's nail them down. Hashtag 2.1, defining evolution and core scientific terms.
Okay, first, the big one. How does the book define biological evolution itself?
The core definition is elegantly simple. Biological evolution is descent with modification.
Descent with modification, meaning
That the characteristics of populations of organisms change over generational time. Lineages change. It's not about individuals changing within their lifetime. That's key. It's about changes in populations across generations.
Okay, now, the scientific terms. Hypothesis.
A hypothesis is an informed guess, a proposition or conjecture about something that might be true. It has to be testable. Maybe this species is related to that species. That starts as a hypothesis.
And a fact. In science, what's a fact?
A fact can be a simple, confirmed observation, like this fossil bone was found in this layer of rock. But more importantly, in this context, a fact can also be a hypothesis that has been so overwhelmingly supported by evidence from so many independent lines of inquiry that we accept it as, well, true.
Like the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. It started as Copernicus's hypothesis.
Right. And now, after centuries of astronomical observation, physics, space probes, the evidence is so strong, we call heliocentrism a scientific fact. It's beyond reasonable doubt.
Okay, so hypothesis, fact, and then theory. This is the really misunderstood one.
Hugely misunderstood. In everyday language, theory means a guess or a hunch. My theory is the butler did it. But in science, a theory is much, much bigger. It's a well-substantiated, comprehensive explanation for a whole class of phenomena.
So it's not just a guess.
Not at all. It's built on tested hypotheses, supported by facts. It explains a wide range of observations, and it has predictive power. Think of atomic theory, cell theory, gravitational theory. These are foundational explanatory frameworks, rigorously tested and confirmed. Hashtag 2.2. evolution as both fact and theory.
So using those definitions, how does evolution fit in? The book says it's both a fact and a theory. How does that work?
This is the crucial distinction. Evolution as fact refers specifically to the observation that life has changed over time and that all living things share common ancestors. This is the concept of common descent.
So the idea that you, me, a mushroom, and a bacterium ultimately trace back to a shared ancestor, that's the fact part.
Yes, Darwin hypothesized common descent, and since then the evidence has become overwhelming. We see it in the fossil record showing transitional forms and the shared genetic code across all life, in comparative anatomy showing homologous structures, in embryology. Literally hundreds of thousands of observations confirm that life has evolved and is related. It's a scientific fact.
Okay, so if common descent is the fact, what's the theory part?
Evolution is theory, is the explanation of how that descent with modification happens. It's the body of concepts explaining the mechanisms of evolutionary change.
Like natural selection.
Exactly. Natural selection is a core part of the theory. But the theory also includes other mechanisms. Genetic drift, mutation, gene flow, recombination, sexual selection. It's the whole explanatory framework for the causes of the observed fact of evolution.
That makes sense. So when scientists debate, say, the relative importance of drift versus selection in a specific case.
Right. They're debating details within the theory. They're working on refining our understanding of the mechanisms. They're not debating the factual reality that evolution happened and that life shares common ancestry.
That's a really important clarification. Uncertainty at the frontiers of research doesn't undermine the solid core.
Precisely. Just like debating the exact nature of dark matter doesn't mean we throw out the theory of gravity. The core principles are incredibly well established. Hashtag tag 2.3, proximate versus ultimate causes, Tinbergen's framework.
Now, you mentioned proximate and ultimate causes earlier. The book brings up Tinbergen's framework to really dissect biological questions. Can we walk through that? It seems useful.
Yeah, Nico Tinbergen, another Nobel laureate, formalized this. He pointed out there are really 4 types of questions you can ask about any biological trait, especially behavior. It helps avoid confusion by separating different levels of explanation.
It divides things by proximate versus ultimate and also static versus dynamic.
Exactly. Let's use the example from the book, birdsong. Specifically, why does a male bird sing? Let's look at figure 1.4 for reference.
Okay, birdsong. What are the 4 questions?
First, the proximate static question, causation. What makes the bird sing right now? This is about the immediate mechanisms.
Like hormones, brain circuits.
Yes, the bird's current hormonal state, the specific neural pathways firing, the physical structure of its syrinx, its vocal organ, the immediate how.
Okay. Second.
Ultimate static, survival value or function. What is the adaptive advantage of singing? How does it help the bird survive and reproduce now?
Attracting mates. Defending territory.
Those are the classic answers. How does the song contribute to the bird's fitness in its current environment? That's the ultimate why in the present tense.
Got it. Now the dynamic ones, involving change over time.
Right. Approximated dynamic.
Yeah.
Ontogeny or development. How did the song develop in this individual bird's lifetime?
So like, did it learn the song from its parents? Is it innate? How did its experiences shape its song?
Exactly. It's about the developmental pathway from egg to singing adult. That's the how question across the individual's life.
And the last one must be the big evolutionary question.
It is. Ultimate dynamic. Evolution or phylogeny. How did the trait of singing evolve over the history of the species? What were the ancestral forms? How did natural selection shape this behavior across millions of years in this lineage?
So tracing its deep history.
Yes. You see how asking all 4 gives a much richer picture? If you only focus on the brain circuits, causation, you miss why singing is useful, survival value, how the individual learned it, ontogeny, and where it came from historically, evolution.
It forces a complete biological explanation.
Very neat. Okay, so we have the modern framework. But to really appreciate Darwin's breakthrough, we need to understand what people thought before him. What was the dominant view of life?
For a very, very long time in Western thought, the prevailing idea was basically stasis, fixity.
So species don't change.
Largely, yeah. The idea, often tied to interpretations of religious texts, but also drawing from classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, was that species were created in their current form and were fundamentally unchanging, immutable.
Maybe some variation within a species, but the kind itself was fixed.
Exactly. Variation was seen as sort of imperfect deviation from an ideal type or essence for that species. Even Linnaeus, the father of our classification system in the 18th century.
Who gave us genus and species names.
Right. His goal was to catalog what he saw as the fixed divine order of nature. He wasn't initially thinking about species transforming into other species. Hashtag tag tag 3.2, the great chain of being.
And this idea of fixed species was often linked to another old concept, right? The scala naturae. The great chain of being, yes, this goes way back. It pictured all of reality, including life, not as a branching tree, but as a single linear ladder or chain.
A hierarchy.
A strict hierarchy. Starting with inanimate matter at the bottom, then lower life forms like plants, then higher animals, moving up through humans, angels, and ultimately God at the very top.
So everything had its fixed place in the order.
And importantly, it implied directionality and progress. If change happened, it was seen as movement up the chain, striving towards a higher state, often with humans seen as the pinnacle of earthly creation. It was deeply ingrained in Western thought for centuries. Hashtag tag 3.3, Lamarck's transformational theory.
But eventually, evidence from fossils and observations started to challenge this static view. Who was the first major figure to propose a coherent mechanism for change?
That would be Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, around the turn of the 19th century. He fully embraced the idea that life does change over time. Evolution happens.
So he was an evolutionist before Darwin. What was his proposed mechanism?
His big idea, most famously, was the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Ah, the giraffe's neck.
The classic example, yeah. Though it's a bit of a caricature of his broader views. But his core idea is what we call a transformational theory of evolution. You can see this in figure 1.6a.
Transformational meaning?
Meaning the individual organism transforms during its lifetime due to its needs or efforts, and then it passes those acquired changes directly to its offspring.
So the giraffe stretches its neck to reach higher leaves.
Right. Through use and effort, its neck gets slightly longer during its life. That acquired longer neck is then inherited by its young. Generation after generation, this striving leads to the very long necks we see.
It's intuitive in a way. Effort leads to change.
It is, which is why it was influential. Lamarck also thought life spontaneously generated simple forms constantly, and these lineages then progressed independently up that great chain of being toward greater complexity. So not a single tree of life, but many parallel lines climbing upwards.
Okay, so Lamarck proposed transformation driven by inner need. But the explanation that stuck, the one that revolutionized biology, came from Darwin and Wallace. What set their idea apart?
It was a completely different kind of mechanism, not based on individual striving, but on variation and differential success. Hashtag tag 4.1. Darwin's geological and biological observations.
It famously started with Darwin's voyage on the HMS Beagle, right? 1831 to 1836.
Yes, that 5-year journey was absolutely formative. He wasn't hired as the naturalist initially, more as a gentleman companion to the captain, but his interests in geology and biology quickly took over.
What were the key observations that got him thinking?
In South America, he was struck by the fossils he found. Giant extinct armadillos and sloths that were clearly related, yet distinct from, the living armadillos and sloths in the same area. That suggested continuity and change over time.
Connection between past and present life in the same place.
Exactly. But the real kicker came in the Galapagos Islands, this isolated volcanic archipelago far off the coast of Ecuador.
The finches?
Well, yes, the finches became iconic later, after ornithologists back in England analyzed his specimens. But while he was there, Darwin was more focused on the mockingbirds. He noticed they differed subtly from island to island. He collected specimens, and later it was confirmed they were distinct species, unique to specific islands or groups of islands. See figure 1.7.
And the tortoises, too.
Oh, yeah, the giant tortoises. Even the local governor supposedly told him they could tell which island a tortoise came from just by the shape of its shell. Figure 1.8 shows some examples. Dome-shaped shells on islands with lush ground vegetation. Saddleback shells on drier islands where they needed to reach higher cacti.
Wow, so clear differences between islands, but also clear similarities suggesting they were related.
Precisely. Why would each island have its own unique but clearly related forms? It strongly suggested they had descended from a common ancestor that reached the islands, and then they diversified and adapted to the specific conditions on each island. This was the seed of common descent and local adaptation. Hashtag 4.2, Malthusian spark.
So he had the idea of descent with modification brewing after the voyage. But he still needed the engine, the mechanism driving the adaptation. Where did that come from?
He wrestled with that for years after returning. The crucial insight famously came in 1838 when he happened to read an essay on the principle of population by the economist Thomas Malthus.
Malthus wasn't a biologist.
Nope. He was writing about human populations. He argued that populations have the potential to grow exponentially geometrically, doubling each generation perhaps. But resources, like food supply, tend to grow only linearly, arithmetically,
So population growth inevitably outstrips resources.
leading to what Malthus called a struggle for existence. Competition, famine, disease, things that keep the population in check.
And Darwin saw this applied to nature.
Here's the light bulb moment. Darwin had seen the intense struggle for existence everywhere in nature. He realized that if more offspring are produced than can possibly survive, and if individuals within a population vary in their traits, and if some of those variations affect their ability to survive and reproduce in that struggle.
Then the ones with advantageous variations would have a better chance.
Exactly. They'd be more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, and more likely to pass on those advantageous traits to their offspring. He wrote in his notebook, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed.
That's it. That's natural selection.
That's the core logic. Nature selects the individuals best suited to the local conditions, generation after generation, leading to adaptation. Hashtag 4.3, Wallace's contribution.
But Darwin famously sat on this idea for nearly 20 years. What finally prompted him to publish?
Another brilliant naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace. We absolutely have to give Wallace his due here.
He came up with the same idea independently.
He did. While working in the Malay Archipelago, modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia, collecting specimens, he also read Malthus. And in 1858, during a bout of fever, the same idea struck him. Variation, struggle, and the survival of the fittest. Wallace quickly wrote up a manuscript outlining the theory of natural selection, and, knowing Darwin was interested in species transmutation, mailed it to Darwin in England for his opinion.
Oh man, Darwin must have panicked.
Reports are he was devastated. He saw his life's work about to be scooped. But thankfully, his prominent scientist friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, knew Darwin had been developing the idea for years.
So what did they do?
They acted quickly and honorably. They arranged for Wallace's paper and excerpts from Darwin's unpublished writings on the subject to be read together at a meeting of the Linnean Society of London in July 1858.
A joint announcement.
A joint announcement. It secured priority for both men and, crucially, spurred Darwin to finally condense his massive planned book into an abstract, which became On the Origin of Species, published the next year, 1859.
Okay, so On the Origin of Species lands in 1859. It wasn't just one idea, though. The book breaks Darwin's contribution down into 5 key components. What are they?
Right. It's useful to see it as a package of related but distinct ideas. Hashtag 5.1. The 5 main points of Darwin's theory. First, just evolution as such. The basic idea that life changes over time. The world is not static. He piled up evidence for this.
Okay, change happens. Second.
Common descent. All life is related through a history of divergence from shared ancestors. This is the idea of the single tree of life. Hugely radical at the time. See figure 1.5b for that branching pattern.
Number 3.
Gradualism. Darwin argued that large differences between species evolve through the accumulation of many small, incremental changes over long periods, not by sudden jumps or transformations. Natura non finds et saltum. Nature does not make leaps.
Okay, gradual change. Fourth, this one sounds important.
It is populational change. This is perhaps Darwin's most original contribution, conceptually. He proposed that evolution happens by changes in the proportions of different kinds of individuals within a population.
So it's not individuals transforming, like Lamarck thought.
No. It's the population's average characteristics shifting, because some types become more common and others less common over generations. It's a statistical change.
And the 5th point is the mechanism driving that change.
Exactly. Natural selection. The primary mechanism causing evolution, and especially the mechanism responsible for adaptation, the fit between organisms and their environment.
Let's really hammer home that difference between Darwin's populational change and Lamarck's idea. The book calls Darwin's theory variational.
Yes, and contrast it with Lamarck's transformational theory. Look at figure 1.6b compared to 1.6a again.
Okay, 1.6a is Lamarck. The giraffe stretches, the individual changes, it passes the change on. Transformational.
Right, the individual transforms and directs the change. Now 1.6b is Darwin, variational. The key insight is that variation already exists in the population. Some giraffes just happen to be born with slightly longer necks, some with shorter, some average, due to random variation.
So the variation comes first, randomly.
Yes. Then the environment, in this case, the height of the leaves, acts as a filter or selective pressure. The giraffes that happen to have longer necks can reach more food
So they survive better, reproduce more.
and pass on their genes for longer necks. Giraffes with shorter necks are less successful. So over generations, the proportion of longer-necked individuals in the population increases. The population's average neck length changes, but not because individuals are stretching and transforming.
The selection sorts the existing variation.
Precisely. It's a filtering process acting on variation that arises randomly with respect to need. Darwin thought these variations were usually slight, so the process is gradual, accumulating small advantages over vast timescales. Hashtag 5.3. The missing piece.
It's an incredibly powerful, elegant theory. But Darwin himself knew there was a major gap,
The
right?
huge gap. He didn't understand how inheritance actually worked. How were traits passed down? How did variation arise and persist?
What was the prevailing idea about inheritance then?
The common sense idea, which Darwin largely accepted implicitly, was blending inheritance, like mixing paint. Offspring were thought to be an intermediate blend of their parents' characteristics.
And why is that a problem for natural selection?
It's a massive problem. Think about it. If a favorable new variation arises, say, a mutation for a slightly longer neck, like bright red paint, and that individual mates with an average individual white paint, the offspring are intermediate, pink.
Okay.
Then those pink offspring mate with more average white ones. The next generation is even paler pink. Very quickly, that advantageous red variation gets diluted and blended away into the population average gray.
Blending would destroy the very variation that natural selection needs to work on.
Exactly. It would make sustained evolution by selection almost impossible. This was a major theoretical headache for Darwin and his supporters. They knew selection worked, they saw the evidence, but they couldn't explain how variation was maintained.
Until Mendel came along.
Ironically, Gregor Mendel published his work on pea genetics, demonstrating particulate inheritance traits passed down by discrete factors, genes, that don't blend right around the time Darwin was struggling with this. But Mendel's work went largely unnoticed for decades. Its rediscovery around 1900 was the key that finally unlocked the mechanism of inheritance and allowed Darwin's theory to be fully integrated with genetics.
So, after Darwin published, the fact of common descent was accepted relatively quickly by the scientific community. But natural selection, the mechanism, faced a tougher road.
It really did. For roughly 60 years, from the 1870s into the early 20th century, natural selection was actually quite unpopular among many biologists. They accepted evolution happened, but they favored other explanations for how. Hashtag 6.1. Post-Darwinian ideas and their decline.
What were these alternative theories?
Well, first, there were various neo-Lamarckian theories. The appeal of inheritance of acquired characteristics was strong, and people kept trying to find ways it might work, maybe through direct environmental effects on germ cells or something.
Still trying to make Lamarck fit. What else?
Then there were mutationist theories. Early geneticists like Hugo de Vries discovered mutations' sudden, large changes in organisms. They thought these large jumps, not Darwin's gradual selection, were the real engines of evolution, creating new species in a single leap.
Like hopeful monsters.
That was Richard Goldsmith's later term for it, yeah. The idea that major new forms arise suddenly through macro-mutations. This downplayed the role of gradual adaptation via selection.
Okay, neo-Lamarckism, mutationism, any others?
The third main alternative was orthogenesis. This was the idea that evolution had some kind of internal momentum or predetermined direction. Lineages were thought to evolve along fixed paths, driven by internal forces, irrespective of environmental adaptation.
Like life was programmed to evolve in certain ways?
Sort of. It was often used to explain trends in the fossil record or features that seemed non-adaptive or even detrimental. The classic example always cited was the enormous antlers of the extinct Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus. You can see it in Figure 1.9.
Those things were massive, like 12 feet across.
Huge. Proponents of orthogenesis argue these antlers were an example of evolutionary momentum gone wild, an internal trend towards larger antlers that became so exaggerated it was maladaptive and maybe even drove the elk extinct.
But that view didn't hold up, no.
Later analysis, particularly in the 1940s, showed it was more likely explained by standard evolutionary principles. Allometry, the way different body parts scale with overall size, means that as deer get bigger, their antlers get disproportionately larger. Combine that with intense sexual selection, where males with bigger antlers win more fights and mates.
And you get huge antlers as a result of selection, not some mystical inner drive.
Exactly. Orthogenesis, like neo-Lamarckism and pure mutationism, eventually faded as explanations because they lack strong evidence and predictive power compared to selection. Hashtag TAG 6.2. The modern synthesis, box 1A.
So how did natural selection finally regain prominence and become the central pillar of modern evolutionary thought?
That happened during the 1930s and 1940s through what's called the modern synthesis, or the evolutionary synthesis. This was a period where insights from different fields, especially genetics, systematics, the study of diversity in relationships, and paleontology, were integrated.
And the key was combining Darwin with Mendel.
That was the absolute core of it. Theoretical population geneticists like Fisher, Haldane, and Wright showed mathematically how Mendelian inheritance, particulate, non-blending genes, provided the perfect mechanism for maintaining variation that Darwin's theory required. Selection acting on Mendelian genes could indeed drive gradual evolutionary change in populations.
Okay, so what are the main tenets that came out of the modern synthesis? Box 1A in the book summarizes them.
Right, let's quickly run through the key principles.
A clear distinction between phenotype, what an organism looks like and does, and genotype, its underlying genes. Environment affects phenotype, but only genotype is inherited.
2. Acquired characteristics are not inherited. Goodbye, Lamarckism.
3. Hereditary variation is based on genes, Mendel, and these discrete genes can explain both discrete traits, like Mendel's pea colors, and continuous traits, like height, influenced by many genes.
4. Genetic variation arises by random mutation and recombination. Crucially, mutations are random with respect to need. They don't happen because an organism needs them. Selection then acts on this random variation.
5. Evolution usually occurs through gradual changes in the genetic makeup of populations, changes in allele frequencies, driven mainly by natural selection, but also acknowledging genetic drift.
6. What we see as macroevolution, the origin of new species and higher groups, is the result of microevolution, these gradual populational changes accumulating over long geological timescales.
And 7. All organisms are related through a branching tree of life, reflecting this history of divergence.
That synthesis really brought everything together under one consistent framework.
It did. It became the dominant paradigm in evolutionary biology for decades, providing the foundation for most research. Hashtag TAG 6.3. Later developments in theory.
Has evolutionary theory stayed static since the synthesis?
Oh no, science never stands still. While the core principles of the synthesis remain foundational, there have been important developments and refinements. One major one mentioned in the book is the neutral theory of molecular evolution.
Neutral theory? What's that about?
Proposed by Motu Kimura in the late 1960s. He looked at evolution at the level of DNA and protein sequences. The synthesis focused mostly on adaptations of the whole organism. Kimura argued that most of the genetic changes observed at the molecular level might actually be selectively neutral.
Meaning they don't affect the organism's fitness. They're neither good nor bad.
Exactly. And if they're neutral, their fate in the population isn't determined by natural selection, but mainly by random chance genetic drift.
So a lot of molecular evolution might just be random noise accumulating.
That was the provocative idea. It doesn't deny that adaptation happens via selection, but it suggests that drift might be a much more important force in shaping genomes than previously thought, especially at the molecular level. It generated huge debate, but is now widely accepted as a crucial part of the picture. Evolution involves both selection and random drift. Hashtag TAG 6.4, philosophical implications, and the naturalistic fallacy.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. Beyond the science itself, evolution obviously has profound philosophical and, for some, theological implications. How does the book address this?
It treads carefully, emphasizing the boundaries of science. Science operates by methodological naturalism. It seeks explanations in terms of natural, observable, testable causes and processes.
So it doesn't invoke the supernatural.
Right. By its very method, science is silent on questions about God, souls, ultimate purpose. Those are outside its domain because they generally can't be tested empirically.
But it does conflict with certain literal interpretations of religious texts, like Genesis.
Undeniably, the scientific account of life's history, based on geology, fossils, and genetics, is fundamentally different from a literal reading of creation stories found in many traditions. That can create conflict for individuals trying to reconcile faith and science.
And there's also the concern about morality, right? If we evolved through a survival of the fittest process, does that justify ruthless behavior?
This is where we hit a major philosophical pitfall. the naturalistic fallacy. The book defines this on pages 42-43.
What is the fallacy exactly?
It's the mistake of assuming that whatever happens in nature, whatever is therefore what ought to be. It's deriving morality from natural processes.
So because lions sometimes kill cubs, which is a natural behavior driven by selection, that doesn't mean infanticide ought to be acceptable for humans.
Precisely. Evolution describes the amoral processes that shapes life, including behaviors that we would consider horrific in a human context. But that description carries no ethical weight for how humans should behave. Science describes, ethics prescribes.
Trying to justify things like racism, war, or unfettered capitalism based on survival of the fittest, so-called social Darwinism, is a gross misuse of the science.
It's completely scientifically and philosophically bankrupt. Our evolutionary history might help explain why certain behavioral tendencies exist in humans, but it absolutely does not justify them morally. We make ethical choices based on values, reason, empathy, not by blindly copying nature. Confusing is with ought is the naturalistic fallacy.
Okay, let's try to bring some of these core concepts together with a final example. The book poses a problem on page 46, asking us to analyze a couplet from the poet Emerson. Striving to be man, the worm mounts through all the spires of form. What's the evolutionary concept embedded in that?
That's a beautiful line, isn't it? But from a biological perspective, it perfectly captures a pre-Darwinian idea.
Which one?
The great chain of being, the scala naturae we talked about earlier.
Also,
Look at the language. Striving, mounts through, spires of form, culminating in man. It depicts evolution as a linear upward climb, a directed progression with a specific predetermined goal, humanity as the pinnacle. The worm is on its way up the ladder towards us.
right, it's that single ladder image, not a branching tree.
Exactly. A Darwinian view completely rejects this. Evolution isn't a linear march towards a goal, it's a branching process, a phylogeny. Think of figure 1.5b again. Life diversifies in countless directions.
And the idea that the worm is striving towards being human.
That echoes Lamarck's transformational idea of internal drives, but more importantly, it implies humans are the endpoint, the most advanced form.
Which is also not how modern evolution sees it.
Not at all. We talk about mosaic evolution. Different traits evolve at different rates. Every living species today is a complex mix of ancient, primitive, and recently evolved derived features. A worm is perfectly adapted to being a worm, just as we are adapted to our niche. There's no objective scale of advancement with humans at the top. We're just one tip on one branch of an incredibly vast and complex bush.
So Emerson's beautiful poetry reflects a fundamentally different and ultimately incorrect view of life's history compared to Darwin's.
Precisely. It highlights just how radical Darwin's shift from a linear ladder to a branching tree really was. #tag outro.
Well, that feels like a solid foundation. We've covered a lot of ground in this first deep dive. We looked at why evolution is central, its practical relevance in things like medicine, nailed down key terms like fact and theory, contrasted Darwin's variational view with Lamarck's transformational one.
And touched on the modern synthesis that integrated genetics, and the important philosophical distinction between describing nature and prescribing morality, avoiding that naturalistic fallacy. Hopefully, you now have the essential context for understanding evolutionary science.
So what's coming up next time?
Next time, we're going to really delve into that branching tree metaphor. We'll explore Darwin's concept of the tree of life in more detail and look at how scientists actually reconstruct these evolutionary relationships, the field of phylogenetics. How do we figure out who is related to whom across the vast diversity of life?
Sounds fascinating, building the family tree of everything.
Pretty much. It's how we map life's history.
Okay, looking forward to it. Thanks for listening to Bookfulness. Join us for the next episode.